Welcome, welcome. I am so sorry. I know this was majorly delayed. I'm not going to go into too much detail onto as to why. I apologize for the delay. Um, I did have some technical difficulties and hopefully got them resolved. So if you are watching, if you have joined in, comment down below. Tell me you're here. Tell me where where you're watching from, and I am so sorry for the delay and being late tonight. But if you're a night owl, at least you may not be night even where you're from. Where I'm from, it is about 10:40 at night. But if you are watching this, hopefully you'll join me live. We are going to talk about some dumb arguments against the Bible, some really dumb arguments against the Bible. We're going to address all of them in detail and kind of talk about it. If you're watching this, hopefully, if you haven't, click subscribe, because I'm also going to be posting a new video either tomorrow or the next day on my Genesis series, going through the trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and what those trees mean and why they're in the garden, and kind of dealing with some questions on that or what those trees even are. So if you're interested in that, click the subscribe button so you don't miss that. We are going to jump into the topic tonight. We're going to talk about some dumb arguments against the Bible. Specifically, I have a website that we're going to look at, an article that we're going to look at. And I'm going to go through some of these claims. So let me share this article. As you can see, it says the Bible is fiction, a collection of evidence. Now, this was written in 2007. I'll make this bigger when we get to the actual article. But this was written in 2007, so it's a little old. But the arguments I still hear a lot online. So I wanted to address them. In my opinion, they're dumb. Now, I want to point out that when I say they're dumb, I don't mean the people who make the arguments are dumb. Some of them they've just heard these arguments and they don't know any better, so they use them. Some people who use them are intentionally just lying about them. And others, they're not necessarily dumb, but the arguments themselves are dumb. They're just not good arguments. And we're going to address why in this video. So hopefully we can clear up some of the issues here and clear up some of these arguments, and hopefully do so with clarity, because I think some people hear these arguments and it throws them off. So either you're a Christian and you hear this argument, it throws you off, or you're not a Christian and you think these are good arguments when they're actually not, and you use them. Hopefully we can clear it up for both sides. So we're going to talk about this article. The person who wrote it, Daniel Miessler, Miessler, I think is how you say it. He is, from what I can gather from the article, an atheist. He is not a scholar in the sense of being a biblical scholar or having any expertise in a lot of the topics he's going to discuss, at least on a scholarly, professional level. He is, according to his About Me page, an AI engineer or something like that, something to do with AI. So not that he's dumb, but not an expert in the field, which will become obvious as we go through this article. So let's jump right into the Bible being fiction, supposedly, and get into the collection of evidence that Daniel Miessler in this article uses. So I will make this bigger as we get talk about it, and then pull myself back up on the screen once. Before we get too in depth on this, I want to point out I think it's absolutely um, just overstated here. Something he says that is not supported by data. He says this would be obvious that these similarities exist. This would be obvious if you weren't brainwashed, basically indoctrinated as a child. But this doesn't take into account all kinds of people who weren't brainwashed into this as a child, who look at these similarities and dismiss them as not very good similarities. So they're Muslims who had a different type of indoctrination maybe as a child and weren't taught the stories of Christianity as a child. And then they convert to Christianity, or atheists who grow up atheists and with atheist parents and don't get indoctrinated and then become Christians later. And he says, well, if they weren't indoctrinated into it as a child, these would be obvious. Well, that just doesn't factor into these people who weren't indoctrinated to this into this as a child. You also ignore the fact that there are many people who do see these similarities. I see the similarities, but as an adult, I can see them, and I don't think they're as strong as he thinks they are. That's not the same as not being able to see the obvious similarities. And we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. But let's get into what he talks about the Genesis flood story, because he says the Genesis story and the character of Jesus. Just so for anybody watching, be careful with the phrase the Genesis story. Genesis is a big book. It covers a lot of different topics. So be specific when you're engaging in these type of conversations. Don't say the Genesis account is untrue. The account of what? The story of Abraham, Jacob and his sons, Ishmael. What do you mean? Creation, the flood, Tower of Babel. What are you talking about? So be specific when you have those kind of conversations. It helps the conversations flow smoother. Just that's kind of a piece of advice there. But he talks about the Genesis story being a ripoff or a mirror or a basically copied from the Epic of Gilgamesh in context to the flood story. So I'm going to make this big again so we can see it. Exist. But we're going to debunk these and talk about whether or not this is evidence of copying. Now, I want to point out people will make this argument. And I want to point out right from the get-go that similarities is not automatic evidence of copying. Just because things have similarities doesn't mean it's copied. I'll give you an example, something that maybe we can all agree on. If, let's say, so 9/11, 2001, the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City. That occurred, which is crazy to me, that occurred over 20 years ago, right? So 2001, so 2021 would have been 20 years. This year, I guess, 24 years? So that's crazy to me. There are adults, people who are adults, who were not even alive when that happened, which is crazy to me. Makes me feel very old. Um, but that happened a long time ago, right? So let's say we had people who wrote stories about things that happened in the early 2000s across the globe. People wrote these stories all across the globe, different places. And let's say that in 2007, just a few years after the 2001 event, someone in the UK, in England, in United Kingdom, wrote a story about 9/11. Okay. Then let's say in 2025, this year, someone in New York City who was alive and an eyewitness to the events actually wrote a story about 9/11. They both wrote this story. Now, there are a lot of differences in the stories, right? But there's a lot of similarities. They both talk about hijackers on a plane. They both mention New York City. They both mention the Pentagon. They both mention Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden. They both mention all kinds of just the general storyline of the event itself is very similar, right? So there's a lot of similarities. Now, does this mean that the person in 2025 who lives in New York City, who was an eyewitness to the events, does it mean they copied the 2007 account that was written by the person in the UK? Of course not. So just because there are similarities in the stories doesn't necessarily mean one copied the other. As a matter of fact, it might not even mean that they're even aware of each other, right? The person in New York may not even be aware of the story that the person in the UK wrote in 2007. So, but yet there's major similarities. And which one has the possibility of being more accurate? The one in 2025 by the eyewitness who's telling the story as an eyewitness, or the one from 2007 from the person in the UK who got all their information off the internet and maybe some news articles, and their information had all kinds of things get mixed into it, like some conspiracy theories and maybe some wrong information that was reported in the news and maybe this, that, and the other. And so that all gets mixed into their story. So they have the similarities, but they have a lot of differences too. And the person who was the eyewitness, yeah, they might have some things wrong because eyewitness testimony can do that sometimes, but they're much more accurate. So the fact that it was written down later, one was written in 2007, which was the earlier one, and the other one wasn't written until 2025, does not automatically mean that the one in 2025 was copying the older one, nor does it mean the older one is actually more accurate. The one who is the eyewitness would be more accurate in this regard. So similarities do not prove copying. One being older than the other does not mean that the one that is older is actually accurate over the one that is newer, which could be more accurate. And the other thing is, he assumes, before we even get to the similarities, he assumes that if two things are, or if one is written down earlier, if one is written down earlier, he's assuming that it's actually the earlier account. But you've got to remember that in that culture, in that time period, it was an oral culture. They passed these traditions down orally for generations until eventually they are written down. How did he determine that just because the Epic of Gilgamesh was written down earlier, that it is actually the earlier tradition? It could be, let me just give you an example. I'm making numbers up off the top of my head, but just for easy math and an example. Let's say there was a flood that occurred. The people in that region start over time passing down stories about it. The Noah story was the primary first, story that got passed down orally. Over time, people started to move and mix with other cultures, and they started adding and changing the story over time. Let's say 500 years pass, and then they write down the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the Noah story may have been the earlier oral tradition, but it just hasn't been written down yet. They write down the Epic of Gilgamesh version of the story, and then a couple hundred years later, they write down the Noah version. Even though the Noah version was written later, it could be the earlier oral tradition. This guy has no way of knowing that. He just assumes that because the Epic of Gilgamesh was written earlier, it must be the earlier account. And that's a wrong assumption, something he can't back up with evidence. So that all those pieces of information about similarity, not proven copying, all of that stuff, none of that, right off the bat, it just debunks his entire point. Doesn't makes his point null and void. But I want to address not just that, I want to address the points about the similarities he claims. Because he claims all of these similarities show that this was a copy. But here's what a lot of people do when they deal with this kind of argument. They'll argue, oh, it's just copying old myths, and they'll point out the similarities, and they will ignore all of the details, even like major differences, but even small details of differences that impact those similarities and show that they're not actually as similar as he's wanting to make them sound. So let's talk about it. He talks about superficial similarities. So first he says, God sent a worldwide flood to kill everyone. Okay, but what are the details of that? Because in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods are capricious. Enlil basically goes into a fit of rage and sends a flood out of a fit of rage. And kind of afterwards, the gods panic. Like they're frightened humans. They messed up. Oops, we messed up. That's not what happens in Genesis. In Genesis, Yahweh judges the world for their evil. And when I say world, you can watch my video on the flood on my channel. I'll link it below. I have a video on my channel that shows that I believe the Bible talks about a regional flood, not a global flood. I have that down in the channel in the description. After I get done with the broadcast, I'll put it down there. But yeah, no. Yahweh judges the world because of human violence and corruption and evil. And it's a moral decision. It's not a fit of rage, not an emotional outburst like in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So yes, God sends a flood, but it's a completely different context. Major difference there that he just ignores. There's a theological framework within Genesis that you don't have in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Then he talks about one righteous man is chosen, Utnapishtim, or Noah. In Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim, it's hard to say, is chosen randomly and even deceives people about the flood, not really a righteous man, and is just randomly picked, not because there's anything special about him. In Genesis, Noah is chosen because he is a righteous man and because he walks with God. Genesis 6:9. Utnapishtim survives the flood, but Noah is specifically saved with a mission by God. So those, again, very surface level similarity, major differences below the surface that he just ignores. He talks about the ark details being the same. That's, again, just that one's just a straight out lie. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the boat, the ark, is a perfect cube, 120 cubits per side. It's a perfect cube. Noah's ark is rectangular, has rectangular dimensions, 300 length, 50 width, 30 height, more barge shaped, and so not a square or cube. And again, as far as the size, I won't go into it here, but and I don't believe these numbers are literal numbers, and how we measure a cubit is in debate and things like that. I don't believe the ark was as big as some people think it was, but we can talk about that in another video. And by the way, if you're watching this and you have questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to answer questions as we go, whether it's on topic or off topic. I'm an open book and would love to talk to you about it. So yeah, no, the arcs are not the same at all. He talks about 2 of every animal. He ignores the fact that In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is no differentiation between clean and unclean animals. In the Noah story, 7 of every clean animal actually goes on to the ark, not just 2 of every kind. There's a lot of order and things that are in the Genesis story that's just not in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He talks about the birds being sent out being similarities. In Gilgamesh, it's a dove, a swallow, and a raven, dove first. And there's no theological reason behind it. It's just trial and error. In Genesis, the raven is sent first, which actually makes more sense, because if the raven doesn't return, it's feeding on dead flesh, and that means that it may be receding, and there's some dead flesh out there, but doesn't necessarily mean there's dry land. Then a dove is sent out 3 times. Clearly, the dove is symbolic, brings back an olive leaf, which is a symbolic thing, or olive branch, which is symbolic of peace. It's the end of wrath. There's a theological messaging here that is being described that often gets overlooked sometimes in the Bible, but it's not at all what is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Completely different meaning and usage of the birds. So that's not it. And by the way, if I'm looking down, it's because I made notes on these things on my computer. So that's why I'm not looking directly at the camera. I'm sorry about that. Genesis is kind of emphasizing peace and divine mercy, and by bringing in the olive branch, things that aren't in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He talks about the ark landing on a mountain. The word mountain here can be hill, and it talks about landing in the mountain, so it can be the side of a mountain. That doesn't mean the waters were all the way at the top of the mountains. But in Gilgamesh, this is Mount Nasir. It's an unknown location. In Genesis, the mountains of Ararat. But more broadly, this would be in modern-day Turkey. This is not evidence of copying. This would just be a natural feature of a flood. If you're telling a story about floodwaters and you're on the flood and you're floating around as the water recedes, the mountain edges and the areas of the mountains are going to be the first thing that's uncovered. So it makes sense that's where the ark would land if it's close by. So that's just a normal feature of a flood. So that's not copying. That's just logic. Then he talks about the hero sacrifices an animal afterwards. Yes, there's a sacrifice. Sacrifice was a common feature of all religions and all ideas back then with God. So that's not evidence of copying. And there's complete differences. Like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when he creates that sacrifice, all of the gods come storming in like hungry birds seeking to eat because they're needy and they're just looking to have themselves satisfied. That's not what happens in Genesis when Noah makes a sacrifice. God smells the aroma and initiates a covenant, something completely different, totally different narrative there. So not really a similarity. He talks about God's regretting the floods. In Gilgamesh, they express fear and remorse because they overreacted. In Genesis, the only time it talks about regret is before, and the word regret there in Hebrew, nacham, means to be moved or grieved. It can be grief, and he grieved because of the sin of humans, because of how evil humans have become. It wasn't regret for the flood, and God's promise not to flood the earth again wasn't out of being sorry or apologetic or feeling like he did something wrong. It was covenantal. He was making a covenant because he was going to redeem humanity. Completely different than the Epic of Gilgamesh. So people try to make these comparisons. There's really no comparison here. The purpose of each narrative is just completely different. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, like humans are like the playthings of the gods, and there's no moral lesson. The flood's a mistake. It's just a fit of rage on the behalf of God. Just nonsense that doesn't compare. Whereas the Genesis flood story in Genesis is about moral judgment and God being the judge who will judge sin and judge evil. Divine discipline shows God's justice and his mercy. They're in balance. This is a whole narrative. It's 2 completely different narratives, 2 completely different messages, they're not the same story. So the similarities are very surface level and minimal compared to the vast, vast differences. not only in details, but in the overarching message that is being communicated. They're just completely different accounts. So, nope, that's nonsense. And I want to point out also, this is another thing that's good to have and to understand about these type of arguments. When people say the Bible like is plagiarizing these other myths, there's three things that they're misunderstanding. First, plagiarism's a modern idea. It's not an idea that existed back then. You can't anachronistically throw plagiarism into the ancient world. That wasn't a thing. With that being said, what they're not recognizing is that sometimes stories, so setting aside this story, because this one doesn't seem to be necessarily a polemic, but like the creation story talks about, and here's a good example, and I talk about this in my Genesis series on my channel, so you can go watch that, but it talks about chaotic waters, right? So it says, God created the heavens, the earth, all that stuff, right? And then it says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Holy Spirit was hovering over the face of the deep. The deep there being waters, and without form and void, one of those words literally means chaos. It's chaotic waters that are existing, and God orders this chaos, right? And that's in Genesis. Now, what's interesting is that the idea of chaotic waters is a common motif amongst other pagan creation myths, right? So you see it in Atrahasis, you see it, all over the place. So the question is, are they plagiarizing that? No. What they're doing is they're taking the motif that is used in these pagan cultures and they're using it to make a polemic. A polemic was an ancient form of writing that would mock the other writings, mock the other gods, the other cultures. So what they would do is they would take their thing, they would correct that motif and mock the other gods. And so how they do this with the chaotic waters? Well, in these other stories, the gods who created everything, they had to often fight and battle these chaotic waters. They would talk about sea monsters and this chaotic waters. Even in some cases, the waters themselves were a god. And there would be this battle for position for the supreme god to take over. And in Genesis, there is no battle. It's, hey, there's chaotic waters, and God, who is sovereign and in control of everything, just simply speaks and brings order to the chaos without a battle, without a fight. And this was a way of writing that was a polemic against these other pagans, saying, look, those pagan gods, they had to fight. They don't have true power. Our God, the one true God, the Most High God, Yahweh, has complete power over the chaos that he doesn't even have to lift a finger to fight. That was the point of it. It was a polemic against these pagan cultures. And so borrowing, even when it is true borrowing, now the Epic of Gilgamesh, there was no true borrowing here. The truth is there was probably just a real flood that occurred in that region, a massive, large regional flood, and then there's a shared oral tradition related to the flood. But with the creation account and other things, there is borrowing, but it's not copying like plagiarism. It's borrowing the motifs to spin it and be a polemic against the pagan cultures. And that was what was happening. That's not plagiarism at all. So no, that they don't generally understand that when they make this argument. The other thing that they don't recognize is that there is no evidence of direct copying linguistically. So in relation to the flood account and the Epic of Gilgamesh, to name a couple of scholars here, Kenneth Kitchen, who's a leading Egyptologist and a scholar of the ancient Near East, says the Genesis flood story is part of a broader ancient Near Eastern tradition, but the differences in purpose, literary structure, and theology argue against direct borrowing. Richard Averbeck, who is an ancient Near Eastern scholar and an Assyriologist, says this: there's no direct textual dependence. The Hebrew text isn't a translated or adapted form of Gilgamesh. He is a scholar of the ancient Near East, and he's looking at these and he's saying, linguistically speaking, textually speaking, within the linguistics, the language, there is no direct dependence. It's not a translation. It's not an adapted form of it. There is no copying or borrowing here. And these are scholars who are saying this, who are experts in this field. So no evidence of borrowing in relation to this story. So nope, that one is debunked. So he says something else, however, is borrowed, and I want to look at that because I think this one's even a more important one. So let's pull back up. This person claims that all this stuff is absolutely the case, that Christianity borrowed from all this. But is that actually the case? Nope, it's not. So let's talk through these similarities because they're all fake. They're not true. So let's go. First, if you look at all of these, they collapse under scrutiny. It's based on false parallels, misrepresented sources, modern myth making. It's not historical scholarship at all. Most of the examples listed come from the 19th and early 20th century fringe writers like Kersey Graves, who wrote the world's 16 crucified saviors, which is most scholars and reject that book. And Gerald Massey. Neither one of these are credible historians or scholars of ancient religions. Actual historians, including skeptics, reject these claims. They're built on cherry picking, distortions, and anachronisms, reading later Christian ideas back into the ancient world. So to give you an example, Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic New Testament scholar, he is not a Christian and is definitely not favorable to Christianity and has no problems rejecting Christianity and saying all kinds of things that Christianity believe that are untrue. on his blog here, which I will share on the screen so you can see, he talks about this. Nonsense. So, um, that's important because I want you to know this ain't just coming from me as a Christian apologist trying to make these arguments. This was specifically scholars who make these arguments. And so let's go through some of his myths here that he claims. So he talks about Asclepios. Asclepios was not virgin born. He was the son of the god Apollo and a mortal woman, and they had sex to produce him. Yes, he was known for healing. That is true. That's not evidence of copying. That's not to be a shock, because we're talking about in the ancient world this idea of gods, right? These god beings, and they obviously believed gods had powers, supernatural powers. So healing was a part of that. So it's not surprising to see a god be connected to healing. That doesn't mean that Jesus was copied from that. Known for healing, yes, but he was never resurrected, never claimed to die for sins of people, never judged the world. And the Savior title, he said he's known as Savior or Redeemer. That was connected to him healing people, and not to him saving them from their sin, being the sin bearer or redeemer in the biblical sense. So, nope, Jesus didn't copy from him. What about Hercules? He mentions Hercules. Hercules was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal. It's not a virgin birth. Again, they had sex. Famous for his strength. So Hercules was famous for his strength and his 12 laborers, not disciples. He was not a teacher, not crucified. There was no resurrection. Savior, in response to Hercules, was in referring to him slaying monsters, not saving humanity from sin. So no, this isn't the same and comparable to Jesus at all. What about Dionysus? The birth stories on Dionysus vary from text to text. There are different myths about Dionysus. One version has Zeus saving Dionysus from his mother's womb and then sewing the baby into his thigh, into Zeus's thigh, and letting him grow there. That's not any way remotely close to the birth story of Jesus. It's not consistent with the virgin birth of Jesus. There is stories of Dionysus dying and returning, but again, not comparable to Jesus. Dionysus in the stories would die and then return for a certain portion of the year and then die again, go back to the underworld, and then come back for a certain portion of the year, back and forth in relation to the seasons. So it was a seasonal symbolism there, and it was not being discussed as an actual historical, physical resurrection, never to die again. There was no sin-bearing role of Dionysus, no moral teachings, no disciples, no atonement. Pagan gods dying and raising is mostly symbolic fertility myths related to fertility, had nothing to do with an actual bodily historical resurrection like is taught in the Gospels. So nope, not copied there. What about Osiris and Horus? And again, if you have questions, and it looks like we got a couple comments here. Let's see what comments are here. Peace of mind, you said thank you. You're welcome. I'm assuming you're talking to me. You are very welcome. And then I got a comment from Letters and Words and Stuffs saying, why didn't Jesus say, hey, you can't beat slaves like my evil daddy? Christians are victims and do not know what they are talking about. If that is true, if that's what you think, we'll talk about that. I actually have on my channel 2 videos that talk about slavery in the Bible. And slavery in the Bible is condemned. It is actually gets the death penalty. You can go watch those videos. Not going to go, it's too much to go into in this live stream, but I've got 2 videos on that and a playlist on slavery. I encourage you to go check that out. You claim we are victims. No, we're not victims. Unfortunately, I would argue the opposite is true. As far as you said, dude, there's so many that are close to the story. Jesus, wake up, bro. Hopefully there's a better God. You say there's so many close to Jesus, but you haven't provided one. And this person didn't either. I'm going through them and debunking every single one of them. So if there's so many that's close to Jesus, you should be able to provide one. I dare you to. It says, according to you, you also said, according to you, they aren't comparable stories. Others disagree. Okay, I don't care if others disagree. I care on the evidence. I'm literally showing what the story is in both sides, and they don't compare. I could say that others disagree with you. Now what? Does the fact that others disagree with you mean you're wrong? Of course not. So your argument doesn't really hold weight there. Try to come up with a better argument. Then you said, no, it isn't too much to go to. The Bible is immoral. The Bible says slaves can be beaten. No, it does not. The Bible actually says that if you beat your slave, you get punished for it. You're taking verses, what you're doing, and I'll get into this very slightly, and it is too much to go into. It's way big topic to discuss on a live stream that has nothing to do with it. I'm going to respond to this. If you keep spamming, however, unfortunately, you're going to have to be kicked out of the chat, and I don't want that to happen. Don't spam just a bunch of comments without giving a chance to respond. Let's have a discussion, okay? The Bible doesn't say you can beat your slaves. First of all, the word slaves, what you mean by the word slaves and what the Bible's talking about are 2 different things. But setting that aside, the verse you're talking about says that if an eye for an eye, right? It talks about death, like you get killed, you get the death penalty. If you beat your slave and they die. It says if you beat your slave and they don't die, then you don't get the death penalty. It says if you, as a matter of fact, why don't we just pull it up? This will make it easier for you to actually see it. All right, let me share my screen here, and I will show you this directly in the Bible. The verse that you're talking about is from Exodus 21, and I'll make this bigger in just a second. But it's from Exodus 21, and it's talking about slaves and being injuries. The whole context, as you can see, the whole context here is talking about injury. And let's see. So first of all, Exodus 21:16, we can start right here. Exodus 21:16 says, and he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if it be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. So right there in verse 16, it says, if you steal a man and go kidnap him and then sell him into slavery, or sell a slave, or that slave that was sold be found in your hand, you're put to death. Death penalty for slavery in the context of the way you're using slavery. I'm going to get to verse 20 through 21 in just a second. Hang on. If right here, this verse, in verse 16, you don't get to grab verses out of context, by the way, and ignore everything around it. That's dishonest, and it's not our way to read the Bible. So verse 16, it talks about slavery. You get the death penalty. It literally says you don't get to worry about just the word steal. You said steal, that's not slaves. It says steal and then sell. What do you think the slave trade is? The slave trade is stealing a man, taking them, and selling them. Selling is slavery. So don't say that's not slaves. It absolutely is. Quit spamming comments. Let me address the one you've already brought up, and then we will get to more. If you spam comments, you're going to get blocked. If you want to have a conversation, let's have a conversation. Stop spamming the comments. So it talks about selling him. So that's talking about slavery. Now, if we go further down, it starts talking about he that curses his father or mother, talks about if men strive together. All right, last chance. Quit spamming the comments. Stop it. Let me get through what you've already said before you continue to post a bunch of questions and comments. To answer this last question you just sent, people sold themselves. It's more like what you're talking about with slavery and what the Bible is talking about are two different things. You're applying a modern 21st century English understanding to the word slave to an ancient cultural context and time. The verse is talking, when it talks about slaves, it's talking about servants who sold themselves to pay off debts. We'll get to that in a moment. Quit spamming the comments. I'm working on getting to your answer in Exodus 21. So the context here is about personal injuries, but it also talks about if you steal a man and sell him, you get the death penalty. So if you take someone against their will, sell them into slavery, you have now committed a crime that gets the death penalty according to the Bible. This is why abolitionists in the time of slavery used the Bible to fight against slavery. Now, when you keep going, it talks about men striving together, smiting another with a stone. So it's talking about the death penalty, right? It's talking about people killing other people. It's talking about death. Then we get to verse 20, and this is the verse that you are talking about. And it says, "And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished." What punishment? What is the context in which this is all looking at? Look at it. Surely put to death. Surely put to death. All of these verses are talking about surely being put to death. The context of this section of passage is about the death penalty. So it says, if a man strikes his servant or slave or his maid, not just a maid being the female slave there, with a rod, and he die under his hand, he is going to be punished, and the context is the death penalty. Notwithstanding, however, if he continues a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. We'll talk about money in just a moment. Another version says property. But it says here, he shall not be punished. Now, you think that means that he will not get any punishment whatsoever. But the context of this is actually the death penalty. So when it says he will not be punished, it's talking about the context of what has been the punishment all along, the death penalty. He will not get the death penalty. In other words, you get the death penalty for murdering your slave. You do not get the death penalty if you just beat your slave, period. Across the board. However, that does not mean he doesn't get punished. No, he cannot beat his slaves. You got to keep reading. And that's where you're struggling. You stop after you read this verse because you don't read the entire thing. You just cherry pick certain phrases. The reason it says he shall not be punished is because it's saying he's not going to get the death penalty. But it doesn't mean there's no punishment at all. If you keep reading. Here we go. Nope, it doesn't mean, don't spam the comments, let me read. It literally does not mean he can beat his slaves without punishment. I'm not struggling. I'm trying to read, and you're spamming the comments before I get a chance to finish responding. Stop spamming the comments. So what I'm saying is, if you keep reading after that verse, it says, get down to, if men strive and hurt a woman with a child, this is verse 22, the very next verse, so that her fruit depart from her, yet no mischief follow, he shall surely be punished. According to the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. And if any mischief follow, then shall he give his life, give a life for life. So if there's death, give life for life. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now look at the very next verse, 26. Look at verse 26. And if a man smite the eye of his servant, we're back to talking about slaves. If a man smite the eye of his servant, strike his servant, beat his servant, or the eye of his maid, that it perish, not even talking about beating him to the point where they get up in a few days. If you just damage his eye, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if he shall smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. If you just even damage a tooth, you have to let them go free. Why? So it's not that you don't get punished. You do get punished. The punishment is just not the death penalty. What it's saying about having to let them go free, this is not just, how terrible of a punishment. You had to let a slave go free. Remember, I said the context of slavery and what it's talking about is people who sold themselves into work for that, whoever, the slave owner, for the purpose of paying off a debt they owed. In this case, they had to let them go free and no longer get that money that is owed to them. It is a huge financial punishment. It'd be like someone punching someone and having to go to court for assault or whatever, and getting having to pay restitution or massive financial punishment or payment to the person, even if they don't get jail time. That is a punishment. So, no. All right, you're spamming the comments again. No, it does not mean he can beat his slave. It means that, again, it comes right after saying eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound. You cannot ignore context. You are intentionally ignoring context and ignoring what it says because you have a bias against the Bible. The text explicitly says that it gives the example of an eye or a tooth. But it's not. This is not like an all-inclusive list of every possible injury. All it's saying, the only thing it's saying is that if you harm your slave, it's giving examples. If you harm your slave, you are punished. That's what it says. That is the context. That is what is being said. You are ignoring that context because you have a bias against the Bible. You have assumed something that you thought was a good argument that you've heard other people say, and you have just spewed it for however long you've ever spewed this argument, thinking it was a good argument, because you cherry-picked a few phrases and ignored the rest of it. And that is what gets you in trouble here. Nope. When it says that he shall not, it never says, look at verse 26 and verse 27 right here. It does not say that he shall not be punished. Verse 26 and 27 says he must let him go free even if he recovers. It doesn't say he doesn't have to let him go free if he recovers. He's still punished. I'm not ignoring the Bible, sir. You are. What you are talking about is the verse up here that is talking about the death penalty. When it says that he will not be punished, he is talking about the death penalty. And that is what he is saying. So if he doesn't die, he doesn't get the death penalty. That's all it means. Yes, all of 20 and 21. The context of 20 and 21, coming with the verses before it, are talking about the death penalty. Exodus 21, 20 through 21, cannot be ripped out of the context of the rest of the chapter. That is cherry picking and quote mining. It is incorrect and makes you wrong. You have to read 20 and 21 in the context of the verses that come before it and the verses that come after it. And the verses that come before it are talking about the death penalty, and that's the context of when it says he will not be punished. And the verses that come after it say that if you even harm them, nowhere near beating them to the point that they, as long as they recover in a few days. It literally says if you harm them at all here, where you damage their eye, damage a simple tooth, anything, you harm them, you are punished. It's just not the death penalty. That's what you're missing. You are ripping two verses out of the context of the full chapter and just ignoring it because you want to quote mine to try to get a gotcha against the Bible. And doing that shows you to be a dishonest person. Someone who cares about truth and wants to know what it actually is trying to communicate doesn't quote mine. They look at the full context. You don't. You just want a gotcha against the Bible. So all you are doing is revealing your bias. Nope. No. To answer your question where you said, does it say they can beat their slaves? Yes or no? The answer is no. It does not. Nowhere in these verses, I'm literally got it on the screen. I'll pull it up and make it big so you can. Dishonest and you are lying. You are ignoring what it explicitly says. You tell me they won't get punished. These two verses that right here, verse 26 and verse 27, explicitly say they do get punished. I'm looking, I literally had the Bible on the screen. You said you have the Bible right in front of you. Yeah, I do too. I even literally had it on the screen for you. I read it word for word. Tell me, does verse 26 and 27 indicate that they have a punishment that they have to get if they beat their slave? Yes or no? Answer the question. And you went silent. Spamming the comments, and all of a sudden you're silent. And peace of mind, thank you for your comments. And yeah, bondservants is a good translation. The word slave in English has a connotation connected to the African slave trade, which is completely different than what that word in the Hebrew means and what it meant in the original cultural context of the time. So we read the word slave in English, and that word has a certain context in our mind that it doesn't have in the ancient world. So why is it evil? No, it doesn't say, okay, so now you say it's only for a tooth or they don't lose tooth, they're okay. The text doesn't say that. You're adding that to the text. You are fundamentally have a big problem with how you understand how ancient law code works. You don't understand, you're not a scholar, you don't understand ancient legal codes. Ancient legal codes did not list out every literal possible scenario like we don't even do this in American culture, but our modern legislation, we list out in statute form as much detail as we can to try to cover all our bases. That's not how ancient legal code worked. Ancient law code gave principles, and then the idea was that it was like a treatise on judicial wisdom. The idea was that the principle would then be extrapolated to everything else. The idea here is that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burning for a burning, wound for a wound, stripe for a stripe. That's 24 through 25. Again, stripe for stripe, beating, right? Any harm at all. And then it gives two examples, but they're not all inclusive. You're trying to make it all inclusive, and the text doesn't say that. So no, it's not evil to punish someone for beating their servant. When did I say it's not God's word? What are you talking about? I have given you evidence from the text that your claim that they could beat their slaves without getting punished is false. I've given you example from ancient law code and an explanation from ancient law code to explain that it doesn't have to list out every possible scenario. So it's not only for teeth and eyes. That's something you made up. So I have shown you from the text that they do get punished if they beat their slave. Literally, verse 25 says, stripe for stripe. That means whether there's any damage at all. If there's a single stripe of me putting a fist on you, stripe for stripe. There is a punishment. It's in the text. You're just ignoring that. It's not my fault that you're ignoring what the text says. As far as you saying it isn't God's word, where's your evidence for that? Peace of mind, you are correct. Peace of mind said, people then did not have the same opportunities that we do in the West today. Correct. People back then, when they went into debt, many times they didn't, if they got into a financial bind, they didn't have a way to work their way out of that debt. They couldn't, they didn't have a credit system where they could just let their credit go bad and they would be turned over to creditors and get phone calls when they owed money. They would have to figure out a way to pay off that debt. And oftentimes that involved them working off the debt as bondservants or indentured servants, you could say, to pay off a debt. Letters and words and stuff, you claim I am ignoring it, but you have not shown any evidence of me ignoring anything. I am looking at the text itself, you grabbed one or two verses out of context and tried to talk about it. I looked at those verses in context, which is the exact opposite of ignoring it. You claim the Bible is absolutely evil, but you haven't presented any evidence of that yet. You said if it were God's word, it wouldn't be evil, but you haven't shown that it is evil. You have shown that your interpretation of it is evil. But you interpreting a couple of verses by ripping them out of context and ignoring the full chapter by quote mining isn't the Bible being evil, it's you being evil. It's you choosing with your bias and hatred to quote mine to have a gotcha rather than caring about truth. You don't care what the Bible actually says. You just want to be able to argue with Christians and say, I got a gotcha. So you rip a couple of verses out of the context of the full chapter, ignore what the rest of the verses say because you don't have a valid argument against it, and then you just say, here, look at this one quote and ignore everything else. That's dishonest. You're a dishonest, unethical person, which is why you're not being taken seriously right now. Peace of mind, I'm not sure what you mean by cut and paste. I'm not sure what you're referencing there. Letters and words and stuff, you don't care. Because if you did, you wouldn't look just at two verses, grab them out of their context, and ignore everything else that I pointed out from the chapter. You wouldn't ignore that earlier in the chapter, it gives the death penalty for the type of slavery you are talking about. You wouldn't ignore the fact that the context of saying they shall not be punished is in the context of the death penalty because you don't get the death penalty if you don't murder someone. And you wouldn't ignore the fact that just a couple of verses later, it says you are punished. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, stripe for stripe, whatever you do to them, you are punished. So you ignored all of that because you don't care. And then you said you can't realize it supports slavery and getting beaten. You are dishonest. No, I showed you evidence that it doesn't support it, and you just ignored it. It literally does give. Here, I'll pull it back up because you're a liar who just wants to lie. context and just pretend that the rest of the verses don't exist. When you do that, you are the one ignoring it. You are the one being dishonest. You are the one with a bias. You are the one saying, I don't care what it actually says. I just want a gotcha. And you have demonstrated that in your comments. Peace of mind, you said many people cut and paste verses to make the Bible say what they want. Sadly, many Christians do the same. That is absolutely true, peace of mind. Unfortunately, many people do that. That's exactly what's happening here with letters and words and stuff. But it is an issue that Christians do as well. And that's unfortunately very sad. People will ignore things, rip things out of context, copy and paste, all that stuff. Peace of mind, can you hear me? Because letters and words and stuff is claiming that he can't hear me, or he or she, I don't know who it is. So yeah. And no, exactly, letters and words and stuff, they don't excuse beating a slave, which is why they punish beating a slave, period. Welcome to the club, period. You're here. Good job. The text does not excuse beating a slave. The text punishes it. If you beat a slave and they die, you get the death penalty. If you beat a slave and they don't die, you get equal punishment, a huge financial punishment, and technically eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and all of that. So peace of mind, when you said, yes, you can hear me, that shows me that letters and words and stuff is a liar. Thank you for acknowledging that. Yeah, he is absolutely trolling. And if it continues, and I don't feel like he's actually paying attention to what's being said, he will end up getting blocked for being a troll. Letters and words and stuff. You said, it said they shall not be punished. Correct. They shall not be punished with the death penalty. That is the context. I've shown you this multiple times. Let me show it to you again. It's strange to me that someone else can hear me when I do that, but you can't. I don't know. That must got to be an issue on your end as a result of that. But I will address it here so that way you can hear me. You said, he says, they will not be punished if they beat their slaves. That's verse 21. That's what you're saying. Or excuse me, that's verse 21. He shall not be punished as long as they don't die. That's what you say. The question I asked is in context to that verse, what is the punishment? Because verse 20, when it says, if they do die, it says, he shall surely be punished. But it does not say what the punishment is. So if this is a law code and it's giving out punishments, which this entire chapter gives out punishments. If it's giving out punishments, what is the context? What punishments is it discussing? It's not going to just say he shall surely be punished without giving the punishment. So what is the punishment? Up until this point in context, listen closely. Hold on. Slow down. I'm reading we're talking about chapter 21, verses 20 through 21. Please stop spamming the comments and listen. If verse 20 and 21, 20 says he shall surely be punished. Verse 21 says he shall not be punished. What punishment is it talking about? Because the text, those two verses alone do not mention a punishment. It just says punished. So what punishment? You have to look at the context in order to know what punishment it is referring to. If you back up, starting with this whole section, this entire section, which with about personal injury, starts in verse 12. Verse 12, it says, shall surely be put to death. Shall surely be put to death. That's the death penalty. Then we get to verse 15. It says, shall surely be put to death. Death penalty. Then we get to verse 16, shall surely be put to death. Death penalty. Then we get to verse 17, shall surely be put to death. Death penalty. Up until this point, everything that has been talking about general punishment related to death, related to someone dying, has been about the death penalty in context. Don't say you're wrong. It does not say you can beat your slave unpunished. Listen to what I'm saying. Wait until don't respond. Don't comment until you hear my entire argument. And then respond to my entire argument. Because what you're doing is you're ignoring what I'm saying because you're too busy trying to come up with things to write in the chat. Stop commenting, listen to the argument, and then have a discussion. Then comment. Okay? Oh, I didn't know when I put so peace of mind, you don't hear me when I put the Bible on full screen. Good to know. I will make sure to correct that. Thank you. So, no, it doesn't. I'm not wrong about it. Stop commenting and listen. Letters and words and stuff. Listen. I'm showing you the context, verse by verse. Please listen. Okay? So, from verse 12 all the way down to verse 17, the context has been people dying, people being killed, and therefore them getting the death penalty. That's been the context the entire time. So when we get to verse 20 and it talks about beating someone and them dying, and it says he shall surely be punished, what punishment in context is it talking about? Answer that question. I'm not failing. You're just ignoring what I'm saying because you're a troll. Answer the question. In verse 20, when it says he shall be punished, what punishment in context is it talking about? Can you answer that question? I'm waiting for an answer. I'm waiting for an answer, letters and words and stuff. In verse 20, if a man beats his servant and he dies, it says he shall surely be punished. The context, which I've already told you 5 times now, and you keep ignoring because you're a liar, the answer is the death penalty. Because the entire context is in verse 12, when it starts talking about injury, if a man beats someone that he dies, he's put to death. Then we get to verse 14. And if they kill their neighbor and he dies, it's the death penalty. And then we get to verse 15. And if he kills his father and mother, it's the death penalty. And then if we get to verse 16, if you steal a man and even sell him into slavery to begin with, you get the death penalty. So all of this, verse 17 is the death penalty. All of these verses are talking about the death penalty. Specifically, every one that talks about someone dying, they get the death penalty. No. If he lives, there is a punishment. We haven't got that far yet. Slow down. So, if he dies, he gets the death penalty. That's the punishment. So when it says that if he lives after a few days, he's not punished, it's talking about the death penalty, the same context. The context hasn't changed, which means that when it says he's not punished, it doesn't mean there's no punishment at all, ever on any type of punishment. It just means he doesn't get punished with the death penalty because the person didn't die, period. Get it? End of discussion. You're misquoting the Bible. You're quoting the Bible out of context and twisting it to mean something it's not meaning. You think there is no punishment at all. That's not the context. The context is there is no punishment of the death penalty. That's what you're misquoting. The whole context, the whole reason you can't just quote mine and grab a verse out of context is because the context dictates meaning, and you're changing the meaning because you're ignoring context. No, he cannot beat a slave. So let's get to the part where it says he cannot beat a slave, because that we've already covered once, but you ignored. Let's keep going. Can't rip one verse out of context, right? You got to keep going. So verse 20 and 21 are about the death penalty, not punishment in general, not saying he can beat a slave, just saying he won't get the death penalty if they don't die. That's all it's saying. Then we keep going. Then we get to verse 22. It talks about hurting a woman. You get the death penalty there. And then you get to verse 24. I've already talked to... Never mind. All right. I did cover it. We talked about the eye and the tooth, and we had a whole conversation on it. You're a liar. But let's go back to it again and keep looking at it. Stop spamming the comments. Let's keep talking about it. All right. Last chance. I am trying to have a conversation with you. And instead of allowing me to continue going through what we're discussing, you're adding additional questions and things that are not. Stop. Can I mute you temporarily? Is that a possibility? Let me see. Yep. There we go. So I put you in timeout for a minute. Chill. Nope, it didn't let me. Hold on. How do I put you? I've already talked to Matt Dillahunty and the Atheist Experience and The Line and all of them before. I'm not a coward. You are. You're a coward for desperately trying to ignore what I'm saying because you're too afraid to be debunked. Now, here's the question. Do you want to have a conversation or not? Because if you do, then you're going to let me continue finishing explaining these passages, and then you can explain why I'm incorrect when we get to verse 26 and all of that in a minute. But if you don't want to have a conversation and you're just here to troll and just continually spamming the comments with a bunch of statements before I even get a chance to finish responding to what we were discussing, then you're just a troll and you're going to be blocked. So which is it? Do you want to have a conversation about this and actually do this, or are you just going to troll? Asking you to have a conversation with me about it is the exact opposite of being a coward, you pathetic liar. Please try to have a conversation. Are you capable of that or not? Which is it? Can you have the conversation, or are you too afraid to have the conversation? Here, as a matter of fact, I'll do one better for you. And maybe this will be easier than doing it through the comments. Do you have the capability of joining my live stream? I can send you an invite to join my live stream. Do you have a capability of doing so? Do you have the capability of doing so? I just asked you a question. I will have you join and we can have a debate on the live stream actually with our voices, so there's not a delay which is causing the issue. I've asked you a question that you refuse to answer multiple times, I said, I'm used to talk to text, good grief. I've asked you a question multiple times. You refuse to answer it. Do you want to have a conversation about this and me continue to go through it, or are you just going to troll? That's the question I asked you. There is a lag. That's not what I'm discussing. What I'm asking you is, do you want to have a conversation where I go through and explain this in context, and then you can actually, after I make my argument, you can try to refute it? Or are you just going to continue to spam short little comments, making it impossible to get through the text? Which is it? You're avoiding my question because you're being dishonest. The teeth, we're going to talk about the verse in a moment about the 26, about the teeth in the eye. We're not talking about excusing 21. We're talking about context, and you're ignoring that. The question at hand is not about what excuses what. That's not what we're discussing. Again, we're not discussing about the teeth excusing anything. That's not what we're talking about. Do you understand that 20 through 21 is only talking about the death penalty? Do you get that? I asked you a question. Do you get that 20 through 21 is only talking about the death penalty? Letters and words and stuff. I asked you a question. I'm going to ask it again. Do you understand that verse 20 through 21 is only talking about the death penalty? Yes or no? No. Personal injury is the heading. That's not part of the Bible. That's a heading that was added by people later. We're not that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, do you understand that verse 20 through 21 is talking about the death penalty? You're saying it's not. I just saw your message that you're saying it's not about the death penalty. Where is your evidence that verse 20 through 21 is talking about a punishment other than the death penalty? For those who don't know, he just responded. I should put it up on the screen if somebody's not following the comments. In the screen, he put, it isn't. When I asked him if Exodus 21, 20 through 21, if he recognizes that as about the death penalty, he said it isn't. So I'm asking him, where's his evidence that it's not about the thing? Where does verse 20 through 21 say anything about letting them go? We're talking about verse 20 through 21. You said, how could it be when they let them go? Verse 20 through 21 doesn't say anything about letting them go. So I don't know what you're talking about when you say let them go. The question at hand is, does verse 20 through 21 say, it says, if he smites his servant with a rod and he die, he shall surely be punished. The person who smites him, punished. And if he continues for day 2, he shall not be punished. That word punished, do you recognize that the punishment it is referencing there is the death penalty? He will be punished with the death penalty if he dies, and he will not be punished with the death penalty if the slave does not die. Do you get that? Do you get that that's what it's talking about? Okay. I asked a question. Please, saying they shall not be punished doesn't say anything about letting anybody go. Saying they shall not be punished. You said it does. 21 part says that they shall not be punished. We're talking about the death penalty. If they shall not be punished, that means they shall not get the death penalty. That's what that's talking about. So are you saying, do you recognize that verse 20, okay, it says, okay, so he will live for beating his slave is what that means. What it means is that he will not get the death penalty for beating his slave. That's what it means. So yes, he will live. Just like if you go outside and commit assault right now and you beat someone, you will not get the death penalty for that in America right now. Now, if you kill them, you will in some places. But in some places you won't. You just assault them, you attack them, they survive, you will not get the death penalty. Does that mean that you don't get any penalty at all or any punishment? No. It just means you don't get the death penalty. Do you get that? Thanks, peace of mind. I do too. I'm trying. I probably came on a little too strong earlier because I felt like he was trolling, but I do feel like now he has slowed down and is answering questions here. So hopefully we can get somewhere here. All right. Okay. You said yes, which is immoral. What is? I'm sorry. You're going to have to be more specific because there's a delay. So by the time you comment, I'm not sure what you're commenting to. When you say yes, which is immoral, what is immoral? Them not getting the death penalty for not killing someone? That's immoral. And you said they aren't my slave, so they can beat their slaves. What? I don't even know what that means. Like, who's not your slave? I don't know what you're talking about. As far as your last statement, where do they get punished then, and what is it? That's what I got to earlier. That's what I was talking about earlier, and you either there was either a miscommunication or you were just not listening to what I was saying. So let me answer this question. Hopefully you don't start spamming the comments again. Let me answer this question. Where do they get punished, and what is it? Let's address that. So if we look in the verses, you said you have a Bible in front of you. I can't pull up my screen because y'all said y'all couldn't hear me. But if you look at the text, after it talks about the death penalty, which ends in around 21 and stuff, or 22, we move on, or 23, we move on to a different type of punishment. In verse 24, it starts with eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And if a man smite the eye of his servant, so there's the slave again, or the eye of his maid, that it perish, the word perish this means it is damaged, he shall let him go free for the eye's sake. If he smite the manservant's tooth, or the maidservant's tooth, slaves again, he shall go free for the tooth's sake. Connecting these eye and tooth right back to the previous verses, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, so on. So verse 24 through 27 is where the punishment comes in. If they kill them, they get the death penalty. If they don't die, they don't get punished with the death penalty. But they do get punished. The punishment comes in verse 24 through 27, which is where it talks about they have to pay them back for the same thing. So if they harm them in any way, including stripe for stripe in verse 25, stripe for stripe, if they harm them, they have to let them go free. Remember that when I said slavery, what it's talking about here is indentured servitude, and they would sell themselves into slavery for the sake of paying off a debt. So when they say they have to go free, this is equivalent to them paying off, like having to give up that money. They're having to pay a huge financial burden, a huge fine, and pay restitution to this person that owes them this debt. They have to forgive that debt, let them go as a result of this. That's a huge financial burden on top of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, the general principle. So We've addressed the claim that they wouldn't get punished for beating their slaves. That's false. Now, you asked another question. You said, so they can still own slaves. Again, what you mean by slave and what the Bible is talking about are two different things. You, by slave, are thinking about something like the slavery in America, like what we had in slavery in America. Forced servitude against someone's will, making them your property in the sense of like that you took them, you own them, and they have no rights in and of themselves and all of that. That's not what the Bible's talking about. What the Bible is talking about when it uses this word, you hear the English word slave, and that's what you have in your head. The Hebrew word that is translated slave here, or servant or bondservant, and the cultural context is talking about people who owed a debt to someone and they sell themselves, so to speak, into working for that person to pay off that debt. That's what it's talking about. And yes, someone who owed a debt could work off that debt, and they could voluntarily choose to sell themselves into what the term slavery, servitude, to pay off that debt. That is what it is referencing. That is the context. Peace of mind, you said think bosses and workers for the most part. Yes, that's a good way to explain it. There is a slight difference, because when we think of bosses and workers in our culture, like I go to work, deal with my boss, but then I go home and my boss doesn't, like I get paid my paycheck from my company, but my boss doesn't have any part of my daily life. In that culture, it wasn't quite the same, because you would literally live with the person most of the time that you sold yourself into servitude to. So you're telling me that people who owe a debt and choose voluntarily to work off that debt is immoral. Give me your evidence that it is immoral. Explain to me how, that based on that logic, when I go to work every day to pay off a mortgage or to pay off my car payment, because so I have a debt and I'm having to work off that debt to get the money to pay off that debt, that's immoral. You think working a job is immoral? That is nonsense. Peace of mind, yes, but the workers don't have a home. Correct. They didn't have a home, so the workers would, or they usually didn't have a home because they would have already sold that off to try to pay off debt. So they would go and they would live with the person that we would call the slave owner, or the servant owner, or however you want to call them. And they would work with them. But that person who took care of them would also, or that person who was the slave owner, so to speak, they would also be responsible by law to provide for their needs, to take care of them, couldn't treat them badly. If they did treat them badly, there's a text in scripture that says if they fled, they could be protected and never returned back to that owner as well. So there was all kinds of protections for them. Absolutely. When you say you should not be owned, again, what you mean by owned and what the text is talking about are two different things. You say it's not the same. What do you mean it's not the same? Got to make better arguments than just generalized statements like that. Yeah, some would stay after the time. Peace of mind said, yep, some would voluntarily stay after because they loved the person they were working for. Freudian slip, nope, there was no Freudian slip. Didn't say anything that would be considered a Freudian slip. Again, you just keep saying words without any context to what you're talking about. You're going to have to give context to what you're saying, or because everything you're saying is just nonsense without it. Speak in full sentences or give context to what you're saying. So you said, no, it isn't, LOL. They could have helped their slave better. What does that even mean? What do you mean they could have helped them better? And no, it isn't what? There's a delay. What do you not get about this? There's a delay. So when you are writing your comment, I'm already past where you're talking about. So you're going to have to give context in your comments. No, it isn't what? And what do you mean they could have helped their slave better? Help their slave how? Yes, I said slave because that's the words we're talking about in the text. That's not a Freudian slip. I just don't mean the same thing by the word that you mean. It's the same word. It just, you have a connotation for that word that is different than the connotation of the biblical word. It's still the word slave. It just has a different meaning. So no Freudian slip there. So we have established that you can't beat your slave. The Bible does not allow you to beat your slave. That was a false claim you made. That's been debunked. So now let's talk about owning people, because you mentioned owning them. I'm assuming you're talking about the idea that it says in verse 21, they are your property. I'm assuming that's what you're referencing. Let me ask you a question, because maybe this will help you. If I look up that word property in the Hebrew, it's kasef is what it means in the Hebrew. It does primarily actually doesn't mean property but money. We'll get to that in a moment. We can't even move on to that because you just made a comment that changed it. So peace of mind, you said who could have, that's an individual statement, not an overall statement. Yep. Letters and words and stuff, you said, I don't buy that it's debunked. We went point by point. You acknowledged that 20 through 21 was about the death penalty and that they could live if they beat their slave, but their slave didn't die. Then we looked at the verses that said that doesn't mean they're not punished. It just means they didn't get the death penalty, because here are the verses that talk about they're being punished. If you think that they can beat their slaves without any punishment at all, you have to make a valid argument. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to dismiss that you debunked it. You don't get to just say, well, I'm just going to pretend your argument doesn't exist. You have to provide a valid argument that would refute the argument I made. And until you do, my argument stands and your position was debunked. That's how this works. So I will wait a little bit longer to see if you can come up with an argument. I was going to make an argument about property or money, but I don't want to move on to that until we have gotten to the point of beating your slaves, which was your original point. So I will give you a chance to come up with something with that. And there was, I think, a comment I missed from someone in here. Yes. So truth over everything. You said, this has been a little while back, so I apologize. I was in this debate with this person. You said, what is the difference between a human and God? That's a very broad question. I'm not sure what specifically you're trying to get to, or if you have a specific topic you're talking about in mind. But the difference between a human and God, there's all kinds of differences. Humans are created, God is not. Humans are not omnipresent or omnipotent or omniscient. God is. There's just all kinds of differences, so you're going to have to be a little bit more specific. God TV Radio, the Brett Keane Show, you put a link. A link to what? I'm not sure what you're referencing. You're going to have to be a little bit more specific. Jojo God Tier, you said, prove God exists, then we will see if it fits the Christian criteria. I don't care what the Holy Book says, just on its own. Jojo, I'm not making an argument about what the Bible says to say, hey, you should believe the Bible because the Bible says this. That wasn't the argument that was being made. I am responding to someone who made an argument against the Bible, and I am addressing their argument. The point of this original live stream, which I didn't even get into everything I was going to get into because I ended up in a debate with letters and words and stuff. The point of this was to address dumb arguments against the Bible, not to prove God exists or to prove or say that you should just believe God exists because the Bible says so. That wasn't the argument I was making, and therefore I don't need to prove God exists right now because that wasn't the point. Brett, as far as God TV Radio, the Brett Keane show, when people do shows, they give links so people can talk to the host. Well, first of all, I would say the vast majority of live streams on the YouTube don't do that. Some people do. If you would like to talk to me, I can give you, the only link I have is a web link, and it would be a link that I'm pretty sure maybe you can, if you have a camera or some way to talk through that web link. I'm not sure if it requires a camera or not. But yeah, if you want to talk, I can talk. But that wasn't really the point of the show. So I can give you a link if you would like. Are you wanting to talk about something specific, God TV? Let me know if you are. And back to letters and words and stuff. There's a lot with the Bible I don't agree with. I used to be a hardcore Christian. This would be easier in person. I don't buy your argument. You have to persuade me. No, I don't have to persuade you. I have to present valid arguments and evidence. Whether you're not, it's your job to be convinced. I'm not here to convince you. It's your job to be convinced by good evidence. It's just my job to provide good evidence. I've made valid arguments. You haven't been able to refute my valid arguments. And until you refute my valid arguments, my arguments stand. Whether or not you're convinced is not the issue. You might be the type person that's not convinced by good arguments because you have a bias. I can't persuade you or convince you. All I can do is present the evidence, which I've done, and you haven't refuted. As far as a lot with the Bible you don't agree with, I'm sure there is. But if it's anything like this, a lot of that might be based on your misunderstanding of it rather than you actually knowing what it says. And yeah, it would be easier in person. It would be easier if you could join the link rather than which I asked, you said you didn't have the ability to do. But it would be easier if you could do that rather than doing it through the comments. So I agree. And then God TV Radio. I'm sorry, I may be an old man. I don't understand the emoji, so I don't know what you mean by that. If you would like me to send you a link and talk about something directly, let me know, and I can give you a link. So you're asking for a link. I asked you a question, though. I will be more than happy to send you a link, but I asked you, what do you want to talk about before I send you the link? So please let me know. Let's see. Any other comments I haven't read yet? I think I've gotten to all the comments so far. Jojo, thank you. Thank you so much for that compliment. No, I am not late 20s. Late 20s would be nice. I am I'm not old by any means. I am about to be 40. So I'm definitely not old, but I am not 20 either. So or even 30. That would be nice. Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have a conversation with you, even if it's just general chit chat. You didn't say anything specific you wanted to talk about. I've got a link here. It says invite guests. Let's see if I can send it to just you, because I don't want 100 billion people trying to get in. All right, let's see. Yep, 40 years old. I I look younger than I am. At least some people tell me that. Some people say I look older than I am, so who knows? Uh, it doesn't. It just gives me a link. So is there a? I don't want to send this link out to everyone because I don't want to have my flooded all at one time. So if you want to put something, I can send it to. Do you have a? Let's see. Do you have a public? All right, I'm trying to see if you have a profile or something I can. Thank you. Peace of mind. I will take that as a compliment. Give me just a second. God TV radio. Okay. So here we go. God TV radio, I found you on X or Twitter. And I was going to send you the link on there, but it's not giving me the option to direct message you. So I'm not sure what's going on there. All right. Well, I tried to figure that out, but it's kind of getting boring for everybody else. I would like to know about where or what you studied. That's a great question. The where. So I will say this: I have spent years and years and years and years and years studying. The what. So you may not know. So I am a pastor. I pastor a church, and my wife and I pastor the church. I don't want to give out too much personal information online, so I'm trying to be careful what I say. But I pastor a church. I have been in ministry for a long time, pretty much since I was 18. I've been in ministry and have done ministry. I went to a college in Tennessee, a Bible college there that has a seminary attached. I did not graduate from there, though. After I left there, I actually met my wife while I was there and ended up, due to getting married and just having kids and all of that kind of just financially put kind of a bind, so we couldn't finish at that time. So my wife went back later, and then she went back online later, and then I went and I was studying general theology at that time, by the way. But then I never actually went back and completed an actual degree, but I never stopped studying. So I would get textbooks and study theology, and I got involved in ministry and would study through the ministry and took courses that weren't for degrees. And my main area of study has been theology in general for a long time. And then in the recent past, have spent a lot of time studying on a personal level through textbooks and all kinds of scholarly resources and reading scholarly papers on the ancient Near East and ancient Near Eastern culture. Reading specifically with an emphasis on biblical Hebrew, biblical Greek, and then the Mesopotamian culture. So I've spent a lot of time studying those things, studied ancient genres as a result of that. And those areas of study and those things have helped me tremendously. But I didn't get it through a degree, but I did talk to scholars. I've taken online courses with scholars who are scholars in this field, more kind of piecing it all together with various topics as I had time. I'm a pastor. I also work a full-time job, 50 hours a week, plus have kids, plus a wife. And so I stay busy. And so I can't go back to school on a professional level, so to speak, to actually get my degree. I would love to, but I just can't right now. So, but I've spent decades studying this on a scholarly level, like studying scholars, studying not just like Bible study or basic theology, but actually studying the language. I can read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek. I can Greek. I'm a little I'm working on Greek. Hebrew. I can read. Pick up a Bible written in Hebrew and read it. So that's my area of study. That's kind of what I've done study wise. Am I a scholar? Like I'm a PhD scholar? No, not at all. But all of my information and the things I put in my videos and things I study come from scholars because I spend all of my time studying from scholars. So I just saw a whole bunch of comments. My thing just froze and then popped up. Let's see. You are into Hebrew, so I like that. Yes, I love Hebrew. Hebrew is a fascinating language, especially biblical Hebrew. You said, I know you know Michael Heiser. Do you know Roy Blizzard? Yes, know Roy Blizzard. There are a lot of scholars and probably very few that you could name that I haven't heard of, and probably few that you could name that I haven't read their work or at least studied on it, and probably even fewer that I haven't heard of. But yeah, Roy Blizzard is a very interesting scholar. Got some great stuff out there. A lot of the scholars. I am very much someone who I read scholars and study scholarly works that I agree with, and I study scholarly works I disagree with. So for me, my wife, my library of books, my wife laughs because she'll go in there and I'll have tons and tons of books that I just disagree with. Some of them are complete heresy. And, but I study it because I don't want to just know what I believe. I want to know all of it. I want to know why. I want to know as much information and knowledge as possible. And, so I said one day when I pass on, before I pass on and pass on all my collection of books to my kids, I'm going to have to like get a stamp that says this book is heresy for research purposes only, and stamp it in the front of the book, because otherwise people might think I believe some of that stuff, and I don't. Peace of mind, you said Greek is tough stuff. Classical is. Yeah, I agree. Greek, for me, Greek has been harder in learning than Hebrew was. And I'm not sure if that's the same case for everybody, but for me, it has been harder to get Greek down. Sorry for putting so much in. Oh, no, you're fine. I don't mind a bunch of comments as long as we're having a conversation. The other person was posting a bunch of comments back to back for a while. They finally stopped and started having a conversation, which was great. But they were posting a bunch of comments with a bunch of questions and things before I could even explain or have a conversation about that. So that's what makes that difficult. I'm glad y'all are here watching. That means a lot to me. Jojo, you said, despite my lack in belief, I respect your role. I hope both you and your family live long, healthy, happy lives at peace. Thank you, Jojo. And I respect you for saying that. There are a lot of people, like we're all humans, right? We can all respect each other. There's two different like types of people on both sides. Christians, sometimes you have the arrogant, prideful, unfortunately unchrist-like Christians who will come in and they will talk to people who aren't Christians and kind of look down on them because they're not Christians. That's wrong. And then you have people who are hopefully are not like that on the Christian side. And then on the atheist side, you have similar thing. You have arrogant, prideful atheists or non-Christians who just hate the religion of Christianity for some reason, and they will come in with attitude and hatefulness and no respect and just, I gotcha, and I think you're dumb and you're an idiot for believing this stuff and that stuff, rather than having a conversation. So that happens on both sides. That's not one side or the other. There's people like that on both sides. And then there's people who truly care about truth and want to know and they may not agree. They may think the belief is wrong, or they may not see enough evidence to support it, and may even think people are dumb for believing it without what they think is good evidence. But at the end of the day, they're respectful and nice. And JoJo, you seem to be that person. So thank you so much for your kind words. And I hope, by the way, going back to that comment, I hope the same for you and your family. You have a long, healthy, happy life at peace as well. Peace of mind. You say Greek is harder than Hebrew. Greek is harder. Hebrew is much easier. I agree. Peace of mind. JoJo seems cool. I agree. JoJo seems awesome. Thank you so much for watching, JoJo. And then we get to the question. Oh, we're going back to the slavery stuff. Letters and words and stuff. So I'm debating whether I want to answer this question or not, and I'll tell you why. It's not because I'm a coward like you called me earlier, or because I'm afraid to answer it or that I can't answer it. I'm debating whether I want to go back down the track of another passage of Scripture that you don't understand, that I will try to explain to you in context, and that you will, at the end of it, say, well, I can't argue against you. I can't give you better arguments or explain why your argument's wrong. I'm just going to ignore you. And I just think your argument's dumb and you haven't debunked anything. If you were someone that I felt like was legitimately interested in wanting to know the truth, someone who, whether or not you believe Christianity or not, or believe the Bible or not, or any of your issues with the Bible, if I truly felt like you were someone who actually cared and you weren't just looking for gotchas, I would talk to you for 10 hours. No problem. I just don't, it just didn't come across that way. I do see your comment here that you say, yeah, sorry about that. I want to follow what is right. And then you said, I want to research, or I have to research your argument more. Okay. I'll give you that. I'll take you on your word here. And I'll address it. Hopefully if you said that you want to address my argument or study my argument or research it more, great. I hope you do. And I agree. I want to follow what's right too. And whether or not now some of my Christian followers, this is probably going to be scandalous. Okay. But it's true. And it should be true for all of us. I want to follow the truth, and I want to follow what's right. And if evidence could be presented to me that what I am believing is incorrect about Christianity, about God, about Christ, about any of that, then I would change my beliefs because I want to follow what's true. That may seem scandalous to some Christians, but to be clarified, I believe the evidence supports Christianity, and all of my beliefs which I hold because I follow the evidence. So I also want to believe what's right. Now, other people might not be convinced by that evidence, and that's fine. But I do want to believe what is true, because truth, in my opinion, is never afraid of scrutiny. And so I'm fine with my beliefs being scrutinized. I just want to make sure that we have a legitimate back and forth conversation. So let me pull up those passages. I'm not going to put them on the screen because y'all were having a hard time hearing me when we were on the screen. So I will just bring them up, and if you have a Bible, you can read them. So letters and words and stuff, you specifically asked, what about Leviticus 25, 44 through 46? I'm going to pull that up. I will also address peace of mind. You said, do you have a group chat somewhere? I don't right now. I do on my Patreon have set up a Discord for my Patreon members, but I haven't actually, I don't know much about Discord, so I'm just now learning about it. So eventually I'm going to have that up and going a little bit better. And I might have like a free Discord version and then a separate Patreon one. I don't know. I'm learning about that now. Again, I look young, y'all said, which is great, but Discord and all that stuff at 40 years old, that's stuff I haven't ever dealt with or used. So I got to figure out more about it and how it works. With that said, let's look at Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. All right. So let's talk about Leviticus 25 first. And I think this is, again, context is going to be key in understanding the full passage and understanding what it's actually talking about. And again, if you want more details on this or the Exodus 21 passage, I have a playlist on my channel specifically about slavery and the Bible. It's literally called The Bible and in that, I deal with both Leviticus 25 and Exodus 21. I believe the first video, I'm trying to see real quick, I believe the first video is the one that deals with Leviticus 25. And the second one, I believe, is the one that deals with Exodus 21. I'm trying to confirm if that's true or not. But either way, I will address this Leviticus 25 passage on here. This live stream took a completely different turn than what I was expecting. I was going to go through this online article with arguments against the Bible, but letters and words and stuff, you came in and it's like you dropped a grenade into the chat, and we just kind of been riding that ever since, which is fine. That is fine. All right. So we need to talk about Leviticus 25 and talk about what this is talking about. So Leviticus chapter 25. Now, most people quote when they argue the Bible's supporting slavery, verses 44 through 46, which is exactly what letters and words and stuff has argued for. They've argued for 44 through 46, which says, and I'll read it straight out. I'm going to read it out of King James Version. It says, both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which you have, shall be of the heathen, the nations, around about you. Of them you buy bondmen and bondmaids. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall you buy. And of your families that are with you, which they begat or had in your land, of them they shall be your possession. And you shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with rigor. Now, that sounds, when you read that verse just by itself without context, it sounds bad. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that. But so does the other verse that we read in Exodus 21 that says it sounds bad when you just read those two verses. But when you read the full context, the perspective of those verses changes slightly. So, I want to talk about Leviticus 25 a little bit more than just reading those verses, and that will give us the context to understand what those verses are actually talking about. So let me pull up here. I've got information on these verses I want to pull up. I'm actually going to talk about the larger context here. So in Leviticus 25, if we back up, we're going to back up, okay? These verses that in this chapter are not just randomly thrown in by themselves. The verses in chapter 25 have a context. So what is the context? So if we go back to the very beginning of chapter 25, in Leviticus 25:1, it says, And the Lord spoke unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years you will sow in the field. 6 years you shall prune the vineyard and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year it shall be a Sabbath rest for the land and a Sabbath for the Lord, and you shall neither sow the field nor prune your vineyard. So the beginning context of Leviticus 25 is talking about when you get into the land, there's a Sabbath rest that you work for 6 years on the land, and on the 7th, you work on the 6th year, you basically plant double to get enough crops and food for the following year as well. Because on the 7th year, you're not going to plant because you're going to give the land a rest. That is what the context that it starts with, okay? So it's talking about the sabbatic year and talking about having that year off, okay? Then it goes into another context. So it's first talking about the Sabbath year. Every seventh year is a year of rest. Then we get into the next. We get into verse 8. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years. What is 7 Sabbaths of years? 7 sets of 7 years. So every seventh year is a Sabbath rest for the land. And every 7 times that happens, which would be every 49 years. So there shall number in thee 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, which is 49. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. That's all verse 8 is saying. Okay. I'm getting a message. Hang on. Just want to make sure that everything's okay. 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 So I'm going to have to wrap up this live stream due to a personal matter. So with that being said, I will, instead of continuing, what I'm going to do for you, specifically for you, letters and words and stuff, I am going to put this into a video. I am going to specifically create a video on this topic, Leviticus 25 specifically. I've already got a video out there, but I'm going to specifically make another one addressing this chapter. And then I am going to link, or I'm going to I'll probably put it up as private because I've already got a video on this, but I want one specifically geared more towards you. I'll probably put it as private and give you the link. So I will comment you and then at you in the comment of it so you can see that video and address this answer. And then my next live stream, if you happen to be on when I am, we can continue the discussion then. I apologize for that. Like I said, I've got a personal matter. I've got to get off and end the stream. I've been live now for a little while. And so I apologize. It looks like a couple hours I've been live. So I apologize for not being able to finish answering that question, but I will. I'm not going to leave you hanging. I will get to that answer. As far as Jojo, your last 2 comments that I'll respond to, you said the main difference between theist and atheist is standard. We have a different standards of proof. Christianity fits yours. It does not fit mine. What is considered adequate evidence is subjective. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think that I agree that adequate evidence might be subjective, but I bet we have more consistent and standards that probably overlap than you realize. And then you also said, I respect the energy, but it is misplaced. Leviticus law is old and no longer practiced. The New Testament would be a better thing to argue against, in my opinion. I agree. I agree with that. I think the main reason people bring up Leviticus is not because they think it's still practiced, but rather because if Christians are saying the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are the same God, then their argument is we're saying God is moral and they think this is immoral, and therefore it's an argument against the nature of God. I agree it's no longer practiced, and so the New Testament is probably a better area of focus, but there's that. And then finally, don't apologize for prioritize your family. Absolutely, Jojo, you're right. Thank you guys for watching, and thank y'all for being here and for having the discussion. And for you, for the person I've thing just froze. There we go. For the conversation that we were having, letters and words and stuff, I want to say thank you, because while at the beginning of this it was a little heated, you came back and showed yourself to be probably a pretty reasonable person. So I am thankful for that, and thank you for watching, and I hope to continue that conversation with you. I will talk to you guys later, and I'm going to end the stream here. Y'all have a great night.